Excited to be here today for the 2021 Virtual Esri Developer Summit. I'm Jackie Roberts, a software engineer and team lead based out of the DC office in professional services. In years past, this talk has looked quite different, focusing on Webpack and Web App Builder builds. Your feedback to the sessions is read carefully, and Randy and I wanted to tailor this year's talk to focus on building out the overall CICD pipeline and how automating that would look for an enterprise JavaScript application. Before we explain what continuous integration and continuous delivery is, let's explore the common delivery patterns we see from with developers or projects not using CI/CD pipelines. We have a developer who is doing a good job of committing her code to source control. She then deploys her application to the application hosting location, which could be copying files to a web server or maybe an object store like Amazon's S3. Often, additional configuration might have to be completed or fixed after the application is deployed. Later, additional changes have to be made as errors are found with the configuration. While this might work for micro applications, this becomes problematic as the project and team grow. Coordination required for deployment and configuration becomes more complex and error-prone. We're humans, and if there's one thing we're good at, it's making an error in repeated manual steps. As our applications and projects grow, often more complexity is added to our deployment process. Large projects often introduce test environments used for quality assurance testing, deployment process verification, and bug remediation. This adds jobs to developers that they aren't interested in performing, and these manual steps increase the likelihood of process errors at every step of the way. Let's explore what CI/CD is and how it can help us improve this situation. Continuous integration and continuous delivery is a framework of tools and processes that we utilize to make our code better and make more deliveries while reducing the time developers have to spend doing process-oriented and error-prone activities. Integration CI/CD lets us deliver faster while letting developers do what they love most, develop. Here's an expansion of the process we described earlier in looking at common patterns we see with developers. It's similar to the software design lifecycle, but focused on tasks. In looking at our goals to increase code-based quality and deliveries while decreasing time spent on testing, staging, and deploying code, we need to think about what we do during this flow. Today, we'll be focusing on improving the build, test, release, and deploy aspects of this process. Let's get some context for the intended audience this year. If we were in person, this would be a good point for Randy and I to poll the audience on the extent to which they have their own CI/CD pipelines built out on their respective projects. That question has many layers to it. Most of us have some varying degrees of each of these steps, whether they be manual or automated, depending on the project's size. It's important to note that with CI/CD, there are many variations to the process and how it plays out. Today, we'll get into a couple examples of how to build out this pipeline. As we begin to convert this flow into our pipeline, we see that the process we're going to automate begins from our developers committing and merging code to source control. Usually, this is when code is merged into master or the release branch being used. What happens during these 4 steps is flexible. What we have here is one suggestion. What's important is that applications go through a process to ensure code quality, and repeatable steps for deployment and testing become automated to reduce user-introduced error. What actions might happen during each of these steps? Let's take a look. Right after a code commit, our build phase will perform actions like running the unit test suite, a compile step that might be using Webpack or the Dojo build for JavaScript, which does file combining, obfuscation and minification, some transpiling for older browsers, combining CSS files, etc. If any of these steps fail, developers can quickly get the application back on track early in the process. Once the build compilation and unit tests pass, we move into the test phase. In our steps, the apps will be deployed to a test environment, but this is one of those actions that could have been done in the build phase if we chose. The test phase is the place to run our automated end-to-end functional tests and additional testing by the QA team. The deploy step is just as important as the testing in this phase because it should be the same script we'll use to deploy into production later. The environment may change, but the deployment of the application is repeated. A perfect step to automate. When in the release phase, we might be creating a tag in Git, archiving the release, and staging it for deployment, maybe to S3 or another location based on our production system. During the official deploy phase, we're doing just that, taking the latest release of our application and moving it into production. We might be doing configuration of production during this phase or back in the release phase, but it should be the same script with different environment values no matter where the application is being deployed. The same or similar end-to-end testing can be run to validate the deployment. Complex deploy phases can automatically roll back if these tests fail. To execute these phases of our CI/CD pipeline, we'll look to automation software. We have many options, and which is the best will depend on our app's environment. For an on-premise solution, we can look to options like Jenkins, Travis CI, or Circle CI. If we're in a cloud offering, we might look to Azure DevOps or AWS Code Deploy. Some source control solutions have tooling built in that can make this type of flow possible as well, such as GitHub Actions or GitLab CI/CD. Sometimes these phases and the CI/CD pipeline will be one continuous job with pauses, and other times they're broken up into separate jobs. I'll hand it over to Randy now to walk us through examples showing these two patterns and a couple of different deployment examples.
Thanks, Jackie. As we see here, we're starting with our project that we're going to be running through a couple of different pipelines. This is an enterprise build sample. It's a really simple project. We can see here the way that it's laid out. We can see we have a build that is being used with the grunt task runner. We have a number of tests in here. You can see a spec folder relating to some karma tests in this example. And if we look in our project, it's pretty simple. We have an index page, some CSS, JavaScript, and supporting JavaScript files and data and configuration. We can see the app. It's pretty simple. We can hide and show some layers, perform some travel ring analysis, etc. So as we go through this example today, we're going to be looking at Jenkins. Jenkins is a easy piece of continuous integration software to set up. It has a very large ecosystem with lots of different plugins that can help us in all sorts of situations as we build our pipeline to get our application to production faster. If we dig into our project, Jenkins has this concept of a Jenkins file. This pipelining strategy allows us to put the entire pipeline within our source control. So if something happens to our continuous integration server, it's a lot easier for us to get this pipeline back up and running later. Just one of those good habits and things to do to get into accounting for failures at every single level that can happen. So if we look into this Jenkins file here, we'll see that we're starting with a pipeline. This is written in a Groovy-like format. In this case, for this particular example, I wanted this task to run on a specific part of Jenkins that is one of their Windows machines. So I've labeled my Jenkins in that way, and we'll look at that together. And then we begin to see the same sort of stages here in my pipeline as Jackie described for us. We have things broken out a little bit. So we have our first test stage, which is a unit test stage. We can see that we're running the test with the grunt task runner in this case that runs the karma test. And on success, we're collecting everything from the karma. They're being outputted in the JUnit format, and we're collecting those test reports together to allow our developers to see what is going on in that unit testing stage running within Jenkins. Next, as Jackie described, we're going into a build phase. And here, you can see we're installing our dependencies. and then we're running a build step. In this case, this is actually going to run a Webpack build, and the output of it is going to be a war. Now, Jenkins has this concept where things could theoretically be run on multiple nodes in a complex Jenkins setup. So in this case, we're taking the war file that's being created, and we're stashing that, because the next stage may be executed on a different Jenkins node than the one that the previous stage was run on. So we're just sort of hedging our bets in case there's a more complex Jenkins configuration here than need be. But if you just have a single Jenkins server and running through, you can skip a few of these steps, like stashing some of these artifacts, because you know as the job runs through its process that all the resources will be available to it on the single node machine. Next, in this pipeline, we're deploying it to our QA environment. You see, we're just using, again, our grunt task runner in this case to deploy it. Now, this is a case where we'll show a few examples today of this deploy step. In this case, our grunt deploy is actually going to take the war file and deploy it to a Tomcat instance. You may not be using Tomcat as your web server. You may be using just an Amazon S3 bucket, or you might be using IIS or Apache. And we'll show you examples of copying files to the right location for Apache as well. And then finally, in our deploy to production stage, we get into a special feature here where, because we get to this input within our pipeline file, Jenkins will actually pause and wait for you to tell it that it is the right time to deploy it to production. So we can have multiple builds all make it to this stage, and then 3 or 4 later is when you actually deploy to production. So let's see what it takes to set up a Jenkins job. So I've set up a Jenkins instance here locally, and while we do have a couple of jobs already created, we're going to go ahead and create a new item. We're going to create a pipeline project here, and let's just call it test for today. Jenkins has a lot of capabilities here. Depending on what your network configuration looks like, you might be able to have your source control software call Jenkins directly through some trigger or action to initiate the build. You can tell Jenkins that you want it to build periodically on a specific schedule. You can also tell Jenkins that you want it to poll source control on a schedule. So in this case, I can put in, and this is using the cron format, I'm saying every 15 minutes from whenever I hit save, check the source control to see if there's been any changes. We can also create more complex build pipelining where we look for a successful build from another project in our Jenkins instance, or we look for GitHub triggering. So here's where we're going to build our pipeline. We could certainly build a pipeline like we saw in our pipeline file right here within this block within Jenkins. Because our project, we've gone ahead and set up our Jenkins file within it, we're going to set up a Git as where our pipeline file is. We're going to give it the GitHub repository URL, and I previously put in my credentials and saved those. So we've told Jenkins here what pipeline file we wanted to use. That file name by default is the Jenkins file. If you have multiple pipelines you have saved in a single repository, or just prefer a different name, for your clarity, you can do that. So let's go ahead and save this project. Now, we could sit here and wait for it to initiate a build, but we're going to go ahead and manually kick that off. As we can see down here, it has begun to execute. We see our pipeline steps visually here on our job page. We see that it has been checked out from our source control library. And the nice thing is, with Jenkins, we can click on each one of these steps and get information about what's going on the server. So here we see that it's checked it out from Git, and then it begins to execute the pipeline. We see in our test phase, it was successful. If we looked back at our pipeline, we saw that there was 3 steps as a part of that. We saw the npm install, we saw the grunt test, and then we see the archiving of the test results. So in this case, we did our initial build here based on our master branch. Our master is in our release branch. So we can see down here, we can change our branch specifier. And for this example, we're going to change it to the Webpack. So we'll save this. We'll see that our view is here. And we'll start to see another build execute. We can go back and we can continue to get information about our previous builds. In this case, it was because there wasn't a Bower file present. Because as we converted this project, we changed our build process, and the Bower was used in an older build style. So as we come back and we see where we are with our new build, we see we passed the test stage again with our same steps within the test process, and we see that our build is going on. We can see what's going on within the build by looking at this step and how it's executing. We can see in real time what happened with our Webpack build, and come back to our test to see how it's going in the process. So we can see now that our build has deployed to the QA server. So let's see what that looks like. So here I have a Tomcat instance running with our sample Webpack application, and we can see that we deployed successfully and that our application is running. And here we see that it actually did an undeploy and a deploy to update the application that was there. Looking at our job, we can see that we're paused, and we have an option now when we hover over the deploy to production step. We can decide to abort the job, or we can decide to proceed if we have checked all the boxes and believe that this application is ready to go to production. Looking at the production version of the application, currently nothing is deployed. You can see we're actually deploying to a separate Tomcat instance than the 8080 that our sample Webpack is deployed to. We're also going to deploy it to a different context. We're going to deploy the production version to sample. We did this so that you could see how you might be able to easily deploy the same application to the same server with just different context names. So let's come back to the Jenkins job. We're going to ask it to proceed. So in this case, the next step is now running. And we got through, and it's running the grunt deploy now, specifying the different port as a parameter. So our application is now deployed, and we can refresh our production application. seeing clearly that the application is now ready for use. So this is an example of a pipeline with a continuous flow, all the way from our source code into our production environment. Now, this might be realistic for smaller applications or for teams with simple infrastructure where this can be achieved. We might have a reason to have a more complex pipeline. So here, let's look at this second set of jobs that I've set up here. In here, we can see a few things going on. We have fewer steps, and we've added a release step. And we have no step that is deploying to a production environment. So in here, let's look at the configuration. We're using that same project in GitHub, the Enterprise Build Sample one. You can see we're using a different branch specifier. We're using the deploy copy branch now. This branch, the Jenkins file, is set up differently than our previous. One of the nice things, as you are beginning to understand how your pipeline should be built and working through getting it right, is once you start, you can either go through that configuration within the project itself, like we showed before, but if you have a version in source control that you're starting with, you can go to the previous job and hit replay. Now, as you do this, it'll give you a place to edit the pipeline, and then you can run it right from here. So in this case, if we're looking at our pipeline, our first two stages are the same. We're building and doing our unit tests, and we're creating that application that's ready to be deployed. In this case, we're doing a different type of deployment step to our QA environment. We're first doing a little bit of cleanup. So if the application exists, we're going to go ahead and delete it. So that way, in case our file's deleted or something like that from your commit, you know that all the files will be in the correct version for your application. And then we'll copy over the latest version of the application. If you'll notice here, even though I'm still stashing the application and unstashing it, I'm actually just assuming at this point that we're running on a single Jenkins node and we're copying the application from the dist directory. The dist directory is where my Webpack build put all the output artifacts that are ready for our application to be deployed from. So in this case, the next stage is our release stage. And we're just going to copy our dist folder, but what we're going to do is we're going to put it over into an archive. In this case, we're showing a really simple example of just copying it over to an archive folder. We're going to archive everything by the job name. So in this case, the job name will be test folder, and so the artifacts will be copied in there. And then we're giving it the application name and the build ID. So the build ID in this case is essentially what's going to become our version number. We certainly can make this more complex. Say we're in the 1.0 build number version if we want. But for this example, we're going to keep it simple. Now, one of the things that you can do within Jenkins, and this is how developers can fix failures so quickly, is I have this final step that we haven't explained before now. So if there's some sort of failure, we can set up Jenkins to send emails. And in this case, it's going to send an email to me letting me know that the pipeline failed. And these are editable fields where we can give it the specific job name and more information about the failure, so the developers can quickly fix these pipeline problems. so that our application is moving through the process well. So why don't we go ahead and kick off this build. We see a very, very similar thing going on. We have a few other things that we can see up here as well. We can see with our past builds how many tests are passed. We can click on those and we can actually get the test results. So this is where we were talking about we were gathering up the test results in that JUnit format and seeing things. So we can see here our test ran in a Chrome headless browser. We're looking at our toolbar test, and we can see that it had 3 tests. They all passed, but we can dig in and get additional information about them if we need to. You can do these tests against multiple browsers if you want. It's all in the configuration of your testing framework. Particular pipeline, we didn't do a end-to-end test example, but you can see how to do those end-to-end tests by looking at one of our test more, work less presentations that have been given in the past, and again here in 2021 with a great example of Selenium testing. We can see that our build 8 passed. We can even see how many commits are involved between this build and the previous build. And we can see that it made it all the way through. There's no pause. There's no waiting for users to do any interaction with it. So let's come back and look at that application. In this case, we deployed it to Apache by simply copying the application to the Apache folder. A simple deployment strategy could be used with IIS or other web servers. So now that we have this pipeline done, our QA team can take over. They can validate that everything is ready to go with the application, and we're ready to deploy it to production. In this case, we're now ready to go look at our ops pipeline. As we can see here, we work through problems in these pipelines all the time, and we can see what things are working and what things are not working. So we can come in here, and this build is configured slightly differently. This build, I chose to show an example of a pipeline script. So this is where we could have chosen to do it from the source control manager, but instead we're just going to put the script in here. This script is in the GitHub under a different name. If we go to our deploy copy branch, you can find this later as the Jenkins file _deploy. So looking at our Jenkins configuration, we see again, we are going to check Apache to see if our sample application exists and clean it up if it doesn't. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pull a job out of our archive and deploy it into the Apache folder. What you might note here is we have a couple things that are different. Instead of using the environment job name and the environment job or build ID, we're going to use the params. And where these variables come from, I've set up here at the top of my job and labeled this as a parameterized project. In this case, the simple example gives me flexibility to do 2 different things. I can specify what job needs to be deployed. So this particular job could actually be used across multiple projects if need be. I set a default value here of test folder to match with their original job. They got everything up to the release. And then we have a build ID parameter where we're going to specify what build we want to deploy. In this simple example, this works both as a good deployment mechanism and rollback mechanism. So we'll save this project, and we just did build number 8 in our folder deploy example. So we're going to tell it that we want it to deploy build 8 into our test folder. Since this is just a simple delete and copy of files, we can see that it's very fast. So we can see it pulling everything out of the archive and copying all the files over. So since we're deploying to the same web server, we'll go ahead and check out our sample web application, and we can see that it's deployed. So as we examine our Jenkins file that was executed during this part, we see in this case that we're just doing a simple copy. This is a great place to know that you could be deploying here to Tomcat like we showed in the first example. You could be deploying to S3 using the AWS CLI, or maybe a library within the Python framework, their Bodo 3 library. Or you can be deploying to any sort of web server that you might have your products deployed to. We could be adding in our end-to-end validation steps, either as a stage after this deployed to production, or as a part of it, to ensure that the application that we deployed is going to be successful. There certainly can be many more complicated deployment strategies, especially if your organization is utilizing containers. You could be spinning up new containers while you're spinning down old containers. So really, the complexity of this pipeline is all dependent on what technologies your organization is using and your comfort level in dealing with those. So Jenkins is a great tool. Jackie and I have been using it on a lot of projects for a while. Let's go back and review the resources that we use so that you can get started using this yourself. So with these resources, you can easily get one of your own projects up and running. Using Jenkins or another automation software, if you do choose Jenkins, they have a great getting started guide for pipelining. Our sample application with the 2 different branches that we use today is available in GitHub. You can see it there in the Esri organization, the Enterprise Build Sample JS. And we use the Webpack branch to demonstrate our Tomcat deployment pipeline. And then we used our deploy copy branch to look at a multi-step pipeline with archiving and deployment to a web server like Apache or IIS. At this stage, I'm going to hand it back over to Jackie to let her bring us home.
All right, thank you, Randy. That was awesome. Thanks for demoing those 2 options that we had with the Jenkins builds there. So for this year, we appreciate you joining us at the 2021 Virtual Esri Developer Summit. As in past years, we always take your feedback seriously, and this helps us plan for future iterations. This year we dove into building out this CICD pipelines with a couple of options and how we could automate that workflow. Pending on your feedback, we'll take that and add on to next year's presentation. Please stay tuned. We have a live 15-minute Q&A to take your questions. Have a wonderful day. Hope to see you next year.
Well, welcome everybody to the live portion of our topic on continuous integration and deployment pipelines. I'm the face that goes with Randy Jones, and we have Jackie Roberts with us. We're so glad that you could join us for this part, and we can see if we can get any questions you might still have after seeing the demo and what we've done.
Thank you to those of you who sent us a note about the noise. We tracked it down, unfortunately, given the format of having to record it this year. I think it was in the video rather than something that was live, so we couldn't stop that, but we do apologize for that.
As we think those of you who went through the polls, we had a few of you join us for those. I know for me, I was surprised by how many are currently utilizing Azure DevOps as part of their process. So maybe that's something that more generally people would be interested in for next year. We'd like to see GitLab and AWS pipelines being used as well. Bamboo and Atlassian product is a great tool as well that's been used in the past, or that I've used in the past, as well as GitHub CICD. So these are great tools for people to use.
With this next question, I'll just read it out loud. Often I see there are a lot of errors with CICD. It took a lot of time to build CICD. Is it worth the time? Because bringing an app to a server is quite easy. I think this is the thing that Randy and I are going to completely say it's an investment, but it's worth the time. When you're working in a production environment, the more time that you spend investing and automating these error-prone steps, the better, because as it gets more complicated, as your team size grows, it can cost so much more in the long run. Just that's been the experience that I've seen within professional services over the years. What would you like to add, Randy?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that it really depends on the complexity of what you're doing as to whether it's worth it to you and your team. Really small projects that don't get updated very often, if ever, maybe it's not worth it. But for those projects that are under active development, whether you're in a custom application, I think I don't know how many people are still heavily using Web App Builder, for instance, as their development platform. But those things would certainly be great things to use a CICD pipeline on if they're under active development. Quick deployments, frequent deployments, so that you can both get it to a place where you can test it as well as then get it out to your users into production. I would say the bigger the project, the more worth it is.
And one last note, I know within professional services, we work on projects that range in size and duration. And one of the things that we're trying to do as developers, just within our own developer community, is to establish these patterns, whether it is, wherever the trend or the wind is blowing. So maybe it is Azure DevOps, and trying to create these configurable, reproducible patterns and steps amongst ourselves so that regardless of project size and duration, we can quickly implement these pipelines and get us up and running. And that's something that, that's being developed and strengthened, that's stuff that we happily share out in the future.
Sure. So we have a number of questions here. So I'll sort of take a couple of the short ones, I think, here, Jackie, next. Is most of what you've demonstrated possible in GitHub Actions? I think the answer is yes. I have not used GitHub Actions a lot, but you might also have to sort of pair GitHub Actions together with other things to make it work. I think it depends on what aspects you want to do here. If you just want to do a straight deploy, I think GitHub Actions can absolutely do that. If you're looking for a more complex pipeline, you may have to combine GitHub Actions with another tool to achieve that. And so I'll take this one. So any suggestions on log management and reporting during CI/CD pipelines? So I'll try to tackle this from a couple different perspectives here. So each of the pipelining tools is a little bit different in the way you could send out notifications, say maybe via email if there's a failure, or if they're collecting the testing results as an example. So if you're doing unit testing, you have reports in JUnit format, for instance, or something like that. Most often we see these things collected within the tool itself, sort of self-reporting, self there, and with some of those notifications coming out of it. So as far as log management itself goes, I think most of that is happening with the tool. We usually don't manage these sort of logs the way that we might think of access log management or usage tracking management. But if you want to go down that road, I think you're looking at an uncommon scenario. So I think as far as this success, you're probably looking within the tool that you're normally using. That's been my experience with Jenkins and the other pipeline products that I've used in the past.
Randy, how about this next one? I'm going to pull over on recommendations for branching and release strategies for CI/CD. So when we get into, are we releasing for master or release branches, etc., I'm going to talk from my experience for my project. I think there's many ways you can approach this for various reasons. And then Randy, please share out afterwards from your own project work. But for us, one of my longer term projects, we released a set of custom tools built on Portal. And so they have to have their own release, like they have their own semantic versioning that goes along with like the version of Portal that they can be deployed to. And for us, because we have customers on various versions of portals, we sometimes have to switch back very quickly and get things up and running. So for us, we use a tagging release on release branches. That just works easily for us. So we have those builds going out and we can easily revert back and get something up on our dev portals and our QA/QC portals so that we can do some bug fixes if that were the case. How about for you, Randy?
Yeah, so once upon a time, I would have recommended a very strong branching strategy with your development branch, release branch, the master branch being everything that's been released. And over time, I think many of us have come to this conclusion that the fewer branches, the better. And so if you're most of our GIS applications that are being built, there's only a small handful that I would say would probably need a really strong release branch strategy. My suggestion would be to use master to create feature branches and do good pull requests, code reviews if your team is large enough to do that. Have good tagging for when you make releases, so that should you need to make some sort of hot fix, you can branch from your tag and do it that way, and then decide whether it needs to get cherry picked back over into master or things like that. But the fewer branches that you're managing amongst your team, I think the more likely that people are going to understand what you're doing, and your team will have more success. So I think that would be my suggestion. Certainly really large projects or projects that have really long timelines to ops from like when you cut a release. I might give different advice. I might suggest a release branch that, you know, hot fixes are continuing to go into while master is still active. Yeah. So Jackie, I'm gonna pull sort of the scary question. In the world of web apps, web maps, hosted feature services, static item IDs, is there guidance around how to deploy these via a pipeline? Yes, but depending on what your application is doing, it's not necessarily straightforward. So my suggestions and my experience, and I'm sure Jackie has experience that she will chime in with as well, is usually what we do is we get everything deployed. It's certainly possible to do it within the pipeline, you know, check to see the existence of a service, deploy it if it's not there, all that's possible. In general though, I find that doesn't work really great with some of our deployment teams. And so we sort of have separate setup instructions for getting those baseline things stood up, the web map, the host feature services, etc. And then we'll take all those IDs and put them in a config file that we use as a part of the build process. So as we get to each environment, we replace the config file. And we could either do that with like a string replacement, or we can just swap the file, the whole file itself. I think personally that's the best way to manage that. Now, that's not to say that we might not use it in conjunction with tools like the ArcGIS Online Assistant to possibly copy content from like a dev portal to a QA portal to an ops portal, and then pull the IDs from the new things that have been created. But I think in general, that's the way that I find the most success in managing these complex sort of items and these things with IDs that we got to reference from our application. Jackie, did you have anything else you want to add on that one?
Maybe a slightly different flavor, but still ice cream. Like we have our config files, exactly like if we're doing, whether it's, you know, like a bash script for deployment or a node script for deployment, we have our config files where we're swapping out variables of all sorts. So we're really just trying to make it as configurable as possible. So it's matching whether it's going to, you know, dev, test, production, whatever network.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to pull over the ES modules one here. So how are ES modules affecting the performance of the CI/CD pipeline? Well, so I've been building these pipelines for a really long time. So my original pipelines with JavaScript API applications were built using the Dojo build. So almost anything is faster and better than that. So, you know, utilizing Webpack and pulling in the ES modules and doing that build, really, as far as I'm concerned, I see only better things than we saw previously. And so I think it's going to take time, and depending on how large your project is and how you have the configuration of the Webpack build itself. But generally, it's worth it. So while you may be doing something slightly different on your dev workstation to iterate faster as you make code changes, and Webpack certainly helps there as well to get you to something the same as your final product or close to your final product versus the Dojo build that quite often would take minutes or tens of minutes to complete a run. Especially back in the days when we were doing it with Java to do that compilation and Rhino. I think only good things have happened to it, and I think doing that build and doing that obfuscation, personally, obfuscation never hides the code in a way that I think is all that valuable, but it certainly optimizes it for our JavaScript compilers to make our apps more performant in a way that makes the user experience better, which is really our goal in doing that build step is making things download faster, load faster, give the user a better experience with our application. Oh, did I not click OK on that?
I think it was edited to add on.
Oh, edited with them.
Yeah.
Hold on. Yep. It's getting that JavaScript. Yeah. So it's that balance of so the edited question is like with the ES modules, the whole point is getting the JavaScript API itself included in our application. Yeah, whether we're using the JavaScript API, whether we're doing a web app builder build, it's if you're using the CDN, it's this balance of how many requests are we doing, how many things are we downloading from the CDN. You know, web app builder as a framework, for instance, is very opinionated in how it's laid down, and each widget has a lot of files associated with it. So if we build those types of applications, we start to strike that balance of number of things we're downloading for the server and the size of them, right? Because if it gets too big, well, that impacts it. But if we're doing too many requests, that impacts it a different way. And we get it. And in both cases, we have a user experience that's impacted negatively. And so we're trying to solve that with this build process. Are there known? Okay, so the next question here. Are there any known cases that legitimate automated security tests in Esri JavaScript context? If so, are there any tools, for example, Jenkins plugin engagements? I'm not quite sure I'm following this question about automated security tests within the Esri JavaScript context. So we can certainly go a couple different ways with this question. Because most of the time when we're talking about security requests in this case, we would be talking about CORS related security possibly, or cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and most of those things take place really is either some back and forth between the client and the server, or but then I guess then the other way that we could go is if we're looking to utilize some tool like HP Fortify possibly to do code scanning to look for potential vulnerabilities in our code. I've certainly integrated HP Fortify into pipeline processes before, both for Python code, the JavaScript API code, web app builder code.
Java, Maven builds.
Java, yeah. I wasn't quite sure this crowd would be on my Java bandwagon. But yeah, so I mean, maybe that's the most relevant answer to this question about legitimate automated security testing. If you're looking at some plugin tool like Fortify, I mean, if you're looking on a different path, like the Java path, you might look at find bugs or some other tools that may not be quite security flavor, but would introduce those things.
I sent a couple messages out to some other PS devs just to get some quick feedback on if they were familiar with any. And one I got back was Probly, which integrates with Jenkins as a security scanner. It sounds like I haven't used this, but it sounds very similar to Fortify Scan, where it's just, like going through and analyzing risks within your code.
Any suggestions on how we can?
You're thinking like system environment variables or?
For API key hiding.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the whole, I think it depends on what you're trying to hide from the user. So the question, I'm going to release this question here. Any questions, any suggestions on how to deal with app secrets in terms of hiding them from the end user? Well, so the API keys, though, aren't necessarily intended to be hidden from the end user. But if you are intending to hide credentials from users, you need to be aware that you probably need to be in a self-hosted application scenario. And Jackie, we probably haven't talked about this in some time, but you're going to look toward the resource proxy page. We have versions of the resource proxy in Java to run in Tomcat and IIS. I think there's I don't know, I haven't looked at this in a while. I think there's a Node version. Am I right, Jackie? Do you know?
I think we use it for one of our, or we used to use it for one of our tools in Node. I can't remember.
Yeah, and so if you're truly trying to hide user authentication, those API keys, etc., you're going to be looking to the resource proxy, which then certain requests from your web application will go to the proxy page, and then the proxy page will replace it. And most of this capability is, if not all of it, is all built in the resource proxy that's available on the Esri GitHub. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of our time. So if you have any final questions for Jackie and I, please get them in. And we hope that you have had a great virtual developer summit so far. We miss seeing everybody in person and interacting with you. We hope that you're having a great GIS year. We certainly will look to implement things in next year's presentation, like Azure DevOps. Maybe we'll look at some GitHub Actions, or what was our other popular ones in the polls here?
Maybe some different branching, tagging, release flows.
Yeah, we can. I will say that back in the previous Dev Summit talks that you can find on YouTube, George and I, who previously did this, did go through some branching strategies. So you can go find those. It's a similarly named presentation to this. So maybe search for enterprise builds in the GitHub, and that will, near the end of those videos would be where we brought that in. Anything final, Jackie, you want to get in here?
Yeah, just thank you so much for joining us and bearing with us as we got through, some technical difficulties, but we really appreciated the questions, and any feedback you have, Randy and I will take a look at it, and we're really excited to implement it for next year, where we hopefully get to see you in person. That's it for me.